He saw the devil in the flesh of Florence and made a pyre to purge the sin. But in the end, it was the prophet who burned. In the final, rotting decade of the 15th century, as Florence wept under the weight of plague, famine, and vanity, a new voice rose from the cloisters, a voice that spoke of fire, judgment, and the end of the world. Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar of ravenous conviction and apocalyptic visions, captured the city's trembling soul. He promised purification through pain, salvation through suffering, and thundered divine wrath against the Medici, the Pope, and the corruption sown into every golden thread of Renaissance beauty. But prophets, no matter how pure, do not fare well in cities that worship marble, gold, and flesh. And as the bells of San Marco tolled, the man who once commanded fires for others found himself dragged to the stake, broken, betrayed, and begging God for a sign that never came. The cathedral was cold that morning, not with the chill of air, but with the breathless anticipation of something ancient, something unclean, something divine. The stone walls of Santa Maria del Fiore, usually aglow with the golden lull of Renaissance pride, now felt like a tomb with its lid half sealed, echoing not with hymns, but with the premonition of weeping. And from the shadows emerged a figure more skeletal than sanctified. Girolamo Savonarola, the man who would not speak to please, but to wound. He walked not as a priest, but as a revenant, as if summoned from the catacombs below rather than from the cloister above. His habit clung to his frame like burial wrappings, and his feet made no sound upon the marble floor, as though even the stones feared the weight of the words he was about to unleash. His face was gaunt, skin stretched too tightly over cheekbones that jutted like broken altar stones, and in his sunken eyes danced not reflection, but revelation, the kind that scorches, not saves. When he spoke, the silence cracked. His voice, hoarse with fasting and fury, did not rise in gentle cadence, but exploded like a fever-breaking bone, each syllable falling from his mouth not as words, but as plagues, boils, serpents, locusts. The congregation flinched with each breath he took, as though his lungs sucked not air but the dust of judgment. "Florence," he hissed, "is not a city of light. It is a brothel dressed as a cathedral, its saints wearing silks, its virgins painted with sin." His finger, trembling with ecstatic tremor, rose toward the heavens like a blade. "And God is watching." In his dreams, he claimed, the Virgin no longer smiled. Her face was pale as candle wax, her eyes bleeding in slow crimson tears that carved rivulets down her porcelain cheeks. Angels, once winged muses of mercy, now hurled down flaming scrolls from the bruised clouds, each marked with the names of the damned, bankers, poets, sculptors, even children. He spoke of fire rising from the Arno, of marble statues vomiting blood, of Lorenzo de' Medici rotting in his crypt while demons carved poetry into his bones. As he preached, the scent in the air shifted, no longer incense, but something darker. The sour tang of sweat mingled with wax, the faint iron of old blood, the musty breath of damp cloth and stone. Women clutched rosaries with knuckles white as bones, while men cast down their eyes, unable to meet the glare of a man who claimed to have walked with Christ through the valley of death. He did not offer comfort. He ripped it away with talons of prophecy and flame. Some fainted. One collapsed outright, screaming about flames licking her feet. A merchant in the fourth pew fell to his knees mid-sermon, sobbing that he had sinned with his scales and counting beads. Even the choir boys, pale and trembling, stopped their hymns, watching Savonarola with the wide-eyed terror one reserves for beasts or saints gone mad. And yet, behind the horror, something irresistible lingered, a magnetic pull in his cadence, a siren song of absolution through agony. He did not beg Florence to change. He demanded that it burn. He spoke of New Jerusalem, not as a metaphor, but as a blueprint, a city reborn in smoke, cleansed by ash, ruled not by the Medici or Rome, but by the flames of divine wrath. A vision not of hope, but of purification. In his private cell, he would later collapse in fits, gnawing the inside of his mouth until it bled, convinced the devil had nested beneath his tongue. He would wake from nightmares drenched in sweat and whisper to the crucifix nailed above his cot, "Tell me I am not alone. Tell me you still want me." His flesh, pale and puckered, bore the scars of self-flagellation, red, angry welts like snakes winding across his back, offerings of pain for visions no sane man would envy. But in the pulpit, he was not broken. He was thunder. And Florence, half entranced, half paralyzed, listened. Listened as the first sparks were struck, not in firewood, but in hearts. Hearts that would soon turn against art, against pleasure, against their own skin, and one day, against him. Savonarola had opened his mouth, and something ancient had spoken through it. Something Old Testament, something apocalyptic, something no longer content to whisper. And the city, though it did not yet know it, had begun to tremble beneath the weight of a prophecy shaped like a funeral pyre. It began with a whisper in the cloister and ended with a scream in the piazza. A tide of children, once cherubic in their innocence, had become the vessels of a terrible purpose. The fanciulli, they called them. But there was nothing sweet left in their faces now, only the tight, righteous clench of mouths that no longer knew laughter and eyes clouded by the ecstasy of divine fury. They moved through the streets in trembling columns, barefoot and draped in rough wool, singing hymns like curses, their voices shrill and fractured, more like insects buzzing than music. In their hands, they carried no toys, only sticks, firebrands, and sacks to collect the sins of Florence. Rouge was torn from the cheeks of noblewomen with smears of spit and cloth. Gilded masks, once worn in carnivals of silk and wine, were smashed under heels that had once danced but now marched. Mirrors were ripped from boudoirs and shattered in the gutters, as though Florence itself no longer dared to look into its own soul. Paintings were seized, even from churches, if they dared to show flesh too supple, eyes too knowing, or beauty too unashamed. Musical instruments were dragged through filth, their strings snapping like tendons in a torture rack. The harps wept one last time before they were silenced by fire, and fire. Fire was the only voice left that could speak above the madness. In the center of the Piazza della Signoria, they built a mountain of vanities. It stood tall as pride itself, trembling under its own grotesque weight. Combs of ivory, embroidered veils still scented with perfume, manuscripts illuminated by long-dead monks whose hands once trembled in reverence, now tossed into the pyre like carrion. A golden lute, once kissed by the fingers of a Medici, was hurled into the blaze and split with a moan, as though the spirit of art itself was crying out in agony. And above it all, above the crackle of judgment and the hiss of liquefying pigment, stood Girolamo Savonarola, draped in black, his robes rustling like crow feathers in a furnace wind. He did not flinch as the heat licked the hems of his garments, did not blink as smoke clawed at his eyes. He opened his arms wide, cruciform, and shouted above the inferno, "This is not destruction, this is deliverance!" But the fire did not recognize salvation. It danced with its own logic, wrapping around objects not yet touched, tongues of orange and white and soot reaching upward like the dead clawing from a grave. It consumed not just objects, but time, memories, lineages, legacies. It erased centuries of velvet and ink with a hunger no holy man could claim as sacred. And Florence stood in silence, watching its reflection burn. The air was thick, not just with smoke, but with something more primitive, more animal. The stench of melted varnish, scorched parchment, boiled leather. The acrid rot of pride turned into vapor. Those who watched began to sweat beneath their collars, and not just from the heat. Some turned away, clutching their cloaks to their faces. Others wept quietly, not for the objects, but for something unnamed, something deeper, something irreplaceable that was being charred into ash and blown into the gutters. Within the crowd, a boy vomited from the smell, but none comforted him. A widow reached for a rosary she no longer had. A painter, hands trembling, whispered the name of a saint he had once loved to render in gold, now melting inside the blaze, his gaze blackening, his halo cracking. And still, Savonarola remained unmoved. His eyes were not on the fire, but beyond it. He saw, or believed he saw, angels rising from the flames like spirits reborn, winged, wailing, radiant. He smiled through the smoke, lips cracked from fasting, and raised his hand toward the heavens as though commanding a vision that only he could interpret. But within his skull, behind that calm ecstasy, something darker had begun to churn. At night, in his cell, he no longer slept but instead wandered half awake in a fevered trance, haunted by dreams that were no longer heavenly. The flames from the piazza followed him inward. He saw his own hands on fire, flesh bubbling and curling back like roasted parchment. He heard voices whispering from within the smoke, not angels, but accusers. Not God, but echoes of his own sermons turned inside out. Each flame in the square, though unseen by the masses, bore his shape in miniature, a black-robed shadow writhing within. And as the crowds cried, "Alleluia!" at the final crackling collapse of the pyre, a sudden gust of wind scattered the ashes over the people like unholy ash from a cursed sacrament. Women screamed as soot touched their skin. One old man began to sob uncontrollably, declaring it was the devil's snow, a sign that Florence was already lost. Somewhere, a priest muttered a benediction, but his voice trembled. The fire had not cleansed. It had awakened. And deep within Girolamo, something began to rot. Not his body, not yet, but his certainty. He began to wonder, was it truly God's voice he followed? Or had he simply mistaken the devil's heat for divine light? There are moments in history when the silence of a crown is more damning than its sword. And in the waning days of the 15th century, Rome chose to answer a prophet not with fire or steel, but with the awful patience of a predator watching its prey bleed out beneath its own weight. Savonarola, now drunk on the scent of smoldering vanities and the trembling reverence of a city still quaking from his sermons, turned his gaze toward the Vatican, that great marble beast bloated with indulgence and honeyed sin, and, in a voice hoarse from shouting in dreams, accused Pope Alexander VI not only of heresy and incestuous gluttony, but of auctioning the keys of heaven like spoiled fruit at a rotting stall. "The blood of Christ," he cried, "has become currency, and the devil counts the coins." But Rome did not scream back. It waited. It watched. And in that suffocating quiet, something inside the friar began to split. At first, the Vatican's silence felt like validation, the smug recoil of a wounded beast exposed. But days became weeks, and silence calcified into dread. Letters sent to the Holy See went unanswered. Envoys returned hollow-eyed and whispering of marble halls where cardinals laughed behind closed doors, spoke of Florentine madness over goblets of wine, while Alexander, the Borgia Pope, entertained whores and serpents in equal measure. And then came the letter, a single scroll, sealed in wax redder than blood, bearing no signature save for the apostolic curse, excommunicatus. Savonarola was cut, not from life, but from eternity. That night, the bells of Florence rang, not in exultation, but like funeral chimes muffled in plague-thick air. Their tolling crawled through alleyways and convents, through taverns and palaces, leaving behind the scent of iron and mildew, as though the very sound carried contagion. Within the stone belly of San Marco, Savonarola sat hunched in his cell, his spine bent as though under the weight of invisible hands pressing him into the floor. His ribs jutted through his skin like branches from a dead tree, and his breath came in rattling gasps that smelled of bile and dust. He had not eaten in 3 days, or was it 5? Time no longer obeyed the sun, only the rhythm of his own failing body and the slow collapse of Florence's faith. And then, the voices began. They did not enter gently, like whispers from saints, but erupted from the dark corners of his mind like boils lanced too late. They bore his own voice, but twisted, pitched high like a child mocking a priest, then low like a corpse gargling its last confession. They laughed when he prayed. They screamed when he tried to sleep. They hissed blasphemies in Latin, backwards and broken, names of demons tucked beneath syllables once sacred. He paced the cloister by torchlight, his shadow jerking across the damp stone like a puppet on a noose. He smeared ash across his face and muttered psalms with lips blistered from silent screaming. One night he clawed at the crucifix above his cot until his nails snapped, and still he cried, "Speak to me, if not you, then at least the devil. Let him show me the price of silence." But only the crucifix answered, not with mercy, but with pus. It began as a shimmer on the wood, a glisten like oil spilled from an unseen lamp. But soon the shimmer thickened, bubbled, and bled. Yellow, foul-smelling ooze seeped from Christ's eyes and mouth, dripping down his carved face like tears of infection. Savonarola fell to his knees, sobbing into the stone, his forehead thudding against the floor again and again, until blood smeared across the moss-darkened tile. The monks grew silent. They passed him like one might a caged animal, glancing sideways with fear disguised as reverence. Some whispered that the Virgin no longer answered his prayers, that she had turned her back. Others, braver or more foolish, murmured that it was not God who walked with Savonarola, but something older, something with wings of soot and a crown of horn. And in his dreams, Florence no longer rose in holy fire. It melted. Streets turned to rivers of molten filth, steaming with screams. Choir boys drowned in fountains of blood. Paintings peeled from walls and cried. The Virgin stood in the Duomo's apse, her face fractured like shattered porcelain, her mouth open in silent horror as rats crawled from her eyes. He awoke screaming most nights, though he no longer knew if he was waking at all. His skin began to yellow like old parchment. Sores bloomed at the base of his spine and wept through his robe. His breath stank of iron and decay, and still he refused to eat. To starve, he insisted, was to purify. Yet even his own body betrayed him, wasting away like a candle left too long before the altar. Florence, once enraptured by his fire, began to murmur, not in prayer, but in unease. Was this the prophet they had followed? This trembling wraith who babbled in the cloister and spoke now not of salvation, but of serpents hiding in scripture? Was it madness or martyrdom, a test or a curse? And in the Vatican, Pope Alexander VI sipped wine, laughed softly, and turned the page of a letter he never sent. The hands that once reached skyward to summon visions now dangled limp at his sides, mottled with bruises the color of rotting fruit, and trembling like leaves in a poisoned wind. The streets of Florence, slick with the filth of famine and fear, no longer parted for the prophet. They swallowed him. He was dragged not by soldiers but by common hands, trembling more from fury than from force, as if the people themselves needed to feel the soft give of his flesh under their knuckles, to hear the dull thud of sanctity crashing into cobblestone. The same mouths that once sang hosannas now spat prayers backward, as if cursing him might reverse the years they had surrendered to his fire. A woman threw a broken rosary at his feet. A baker smeared pig's blood across his robe. A child, eyes hollow, belly swollen from hunger, whispered, "Devil." The French, once the divine sword in Savonarola's rhetoric, had turned heel and left Florence smoldering in its own confusion. Their departure felt less like betrayal and more like divine retraction. There would be no New Jerusalem, only ruin, and ruin always demands a sacrifice. They stripped him, not with speed, but with ritual. Each tug of cloth, each exposed limb, was an unholy rite, the unmaking of a saint. In the shadow of the Palazzo Vecchio, they bound him in chains so tight they bit into the bone, and then hauled him upward, not into heaven, but into the bell tower's mouth, a stone womb lined with mildew, where the floor never dried and the ceiling always wept. It stank of damp straw, rat droppings, and a sweetness that could only be decay. The rats were the first to greet him, fearless from hunger, bold from rot. At night they skittered over his bare legs, drawn to the sweat pooling in the hollows of his knees, gnawing at soft skin like communion. The lice, meanwhile, bloomed across his scalp and back in constellations of misery, laying eggs beneath scabs, writhing in the pus of old wounds reopened by the lash. The guards who entered his cell did not speak. They gagged themselves with cloth soaked in vinegar, as if his presence alone were contagious, a sickness that could warp the soul or curdle milk. They avoided his eyes, not out of pity, but superstition. Some said the prophet still carried fire in his gaze, that to meet it was to dream of hell. He was tortured, not for confession, but for spectacle. The rack groaned like a church organ in agony, stretching tendon from bone, ligament from socket, until his arms no longer bent, and his spine sounded like kindling beneath wet fingers. Each scream he gave was wet and ragged, bubbling with phlegm and blood. His lips split like parchment, and his tongue, blackened at the edges, stuttered psalms not in reverence, but as a drowning man might sputter air between gulps of water. "Domine, libera me, Domine!" And then silence. When they whipped him, they counted not in numbers, but in sins. Each strike a forgotten vanity, each lash an echo of his own sermons, twisted, turned back on him. A flagellant priest, trembling and unsure, cried as he struck him, not for the pain he inflicted, but for the prophecy he feared was being unraveled too late. "Forgive me, Father, forgive me," he whispered with every stroke. His skin began to peel in sheets, yellowed and soft like candle wax held to flame. Beneath it, ulcers festered, open mouths of flesh that oozed and cried. Fever took hold like a demon perched on his chest. He sweated through straw, and the liquid pooled beneath him like sacrament spoiled. Flies buzzed at the edges of the cell, orbiting his wounds like worshippers unsure whether to pray or feast. Yet he still whispered, even as his tongue swelled and cracked, even as blood pooled in his throat. He saw angels at the edges of the dark, not radiant, not merciful, but ash-winged and eyeless, beckoning him with fingers made of soot and bone. He spoke to them, asked them for fire, not to save him, no, not anymore, but to cleanse, to finish what he had begun. "I am the altar," he murmured through cracked teeth. "Burn me, burn it all." But Florence no longer sought altars. It sought catharsis. No martyrdom would be permitted, no miracles would be recorded, no relics would be kept, only the execution, public, final, and without grace. And in the silence of the bell tower, with rats nesting near his feet and blood soaking through stone, Girolamo Savonarola understood at last. He would not ascend. He would fall, piece by piece, lash by lash, into the same fire he once called holy. On the 23rd of May, in the year of our Lord 1506, the air in Florence did not stir with spring's renewal, but hung thick and metallic, as though the city itself had begun to decay from the inside out. The morning dawned pale and sallow, the light a sickly hue that could not quite pass for gold, and above the Piazza della Signoria, the sky sagged like bruised flesh, a shroud drawn over a corpse not yet laid to rest. In the square, the pyre waited, obscene in its silence. Built high and haphazard, its timber oozed with pitch, its base soaked with oil so pungent it burned the eyes to inhale. Flies buzzed in anticipation, drawn by a scent that had not yet come, but already seemed to linger, a phantom of charred meat and old blood. The scaffold groaned beneath its own weight, as though reluctant to host the execution it had been made for. And then, through a corridor of armored men and whispering mouths, came the broken shadow of a man once mistaken for a prophet. Savonarola was unrecognizable, a ragged phantom of fever and famine, dragged into the light like an exhumed saint whose miracles had long since turned to maggots. His body, naked but for the stains of his suffering, was a map of ruin, ribs like prison bars beneath gray-yellow skin, legs no thicker than reeds, shaking with each step as if the earth itself rejected him. His face was sunken, mouth slack with fever, beard caked with dried spittle and bile, and his eyes, those infamous eyes that once froze entire congregations in place, now darted like those of a wounded animal, searching for mercy in a crowd that had long since ceased to believe in it. They bound his wrists with wet rope to prevent immediate combustion, and the knot dug deep into ulcered flesh, releasing a slow ooze of blood that trickled down his arm like a sacrament turned sour. The executioner, a man seasoned by years of sanctioned violence, hesitated, not out of pity, but because in that moment, Girolamo Savonarola did not resemble a man at all, but something older, something cursed, something that should not have been seen by daylight. The priest assigned to read him his final rites trembled so violently that the crucifix slipped from his fingers, landing in the mud like a forgotten relic. He did not pick it up. Then came the hanging. It was not swift. His body rose into the air like a marionette possessed, arms spasming, mouth agape, spittle trailing like thread, eyes rolling until only the whites remained. A crack echoed through the square, not of neck, but of joint, and for a moment he twitched against the rope, not in agony, but in what seemed almost ecstasy. As if he had seen something, as if the veil had parted, and then his head slumped, and silence fell. Not peaceful, but coiled and waiting. The pyre was lit. The fire rose slow at first, lapping at his feet like a cautious dog sniffing an intruder. Then, finding its courage, it surged, a roar of orange and black, swallowing the scaffold with a hungry breath. The ropes burned away quickly, and his body dropped into the flames like a penance finally claimed. And still, the fire did not consume him quickly. His flesh, tightened by starvation and drenched in sweat, resisted the heat with a stubbornness born of madness. Blisters erupted like boils across his limbs, bursting with hissing jets of yellow fluid. His skin curled back from the bone, peeling in sheets like the bark of a dying tree, revealing tendons that snapped like violin strings in the heat. The fat beneath his stomach caught, and for a brief moment, the stench changed. From smoke and pitch to roasted meat, sweet and unholy, a smell that twisted the stomach and made the soul recoil. Some in the crowd turned away, gagging. Others crossed themselves and whispered prayers, not for his soul, but for their own. A child asked, "Why won't he die?" And then came the sound. It rose above the flames, a shriek or a chant, or something that should not have had a voice anymore. A ragged burst of sound that might once have been laughter, not joyful, but delirious, mocking, eternal. The kind of sound that made teeth ache and eyes water. The kind of sound that should have come from beneath the earth. Some said it was the devil, come to claim what was his. Others, older, more afraid, said it was worse, that it was God, laughing at the prophet who dared to speak for him. When it was done, nothing remained but twisted iron nails and blackened teeth. No relics, no bones, no ashes worthy of urn or altar. Only dust, scattered into the wind as if Florence itself had exhaled. Finally, violently, the last breath of a prophecy it could not survive. The square reeked for days. The scaffolding was torn down, but the scorch marks remained, deep in the stone, like wounds that would never close. And the people of Florence, though they spoke no more of him aloud, began to sleep less soundly, to dream more darkly, to hear, sometimes, the faint crackle of fire when there was none. Because some fires die with smoke, others burn inward, forever. The execution was not the end. It never is. The body may blister, the screams may fade, but the echo, that lingers, that rots. They scattered what was left of him into the Arno not out of mercy, but of terror. A fear that even his bones might fester, might whisper in the vault of some cathedral, or bloom miracles in the soil if ever allowed to rest. And so they shattered his remains with iron, burned them thrice over, and let the river swallow the ash. The water turned black for a moment. Some say the fish died, others say they spoke. The wind that day was cruel. It lifted the soot of his body and carried it not away, but back through the city's alleys and archways, past the market stalls, past the frescoed chapels he once condemned. It dusted the hems of noble women's gowns, clung to the lips of sculptors, and settled in the cracks between flagstones. As if, even in death, Savonarola refused to be silenced, seeping into the pores of Florence like a stain no washing could lift. And yet, life, as it always does, slithered on. The artists returned, the colors returned, and with them came the laughter, the music, the velvet, and the vices. The palaces opened their doors once more to sin disguised as splendor. The paintings he would have burned were restored, glazed, and praised in gilded frames. The whores sang again. The Medici crept back into their chairs. Rome, fat and smiling, sent gifts. But something beneath the marble had cracked. Florence, though it preened and powdered itself anew, had been wounded, not in flesh, but in spirit. And though no one dared to speak his name aloud in the months that followed, they walked faster past San Marco, and they lit fewer candles at the altar. They grew more afraid of silence, of stillness, of fire. Because Girolamo Savonarola was not merely a man. He was an infection, a holy fever, a blight in the blood of beauty. He was the scream behind the choir, the worm inside the fruit, the tremor behind the smile. He had not just prophesied doom, he had embodied it, with bones that creaked like burnt scripture and eyes that reflected not heaven but the void beneath it. And in killing him, Florence did not merely kill a preacher, it extinguished a part of itself, the part that dared to believe it could ever be clean. The fire did not die that day. It folded itself into quieter things. It learned to whisper, to wear perfume, to hide behind silk and oil and song. It bled into the art it once sought to destroy. It crept beneath the canvases, into the shadows of saints, into the folds of tapestries where angels now smile too sweetly. It breathed through brushstrokes and echoed in sculpture, not in what was shown, but in what was omitted. And centuries later, when tourists marvel at the beauty of Florence, when they praise the golden domes and weep at the painted faces of Madonnas, they do not know that they are also looking at him, at what was done, at what was buried, and what was never buried deeply enough. Because some prophets die in fire, and some become it,